phase of life from childhood to adult. So this stage can take many years. And there are so many things that happen along the continuum. But many agree that it's actually a socially constructed concept. It's not manufactured in the laboratory that say, yes, we manufacture this definition and say, yes, it's a youth, we can fit into that. But it's a construction, it's a social construction that carries along with it several aspects: families, friends, and relatives, schools, the society, and so forth. So through that, experiences, learnings, and what people see and conceive begin to form what that person is about. So it's a part of the society. To be a youth and to go through this stage is what the society offers you and what also that individual will offer later. So globally, the last 2 decades have seen an increased focus on youth as contributors to situations of social unrest. What we call Arab Spring, for example, has been attributed entirely to the youth initiatives, even if we could see that some of the older generations, like lawyers, doctors, were behind organizing the Arab Spring in those years, but on the forefront we see the youth. So it has been attributed to youth that they are actually part of social unrest in the society. They engage very easily in armed conflicts, and they're very quick to engage in violent activities. So these experiences of youth engaging in violence are being linked to lack of developmental issues, such as poverty, unemployment, and biological and social and political reasons. There are so many reasons being given why youth are actually engaging in some of these activities, including being recruited to be radicalized. But then we will see that some of these assumptions are not true, because some of the youth who are actually engaging into violent extremism are not poor, they are not entirely unemployed, they are from affluent families, they have studied in very big, nice, good universities, and they go and exploit themselves. For example, in UK, in the US, some of these youth are very, very rich. They're from rich families. So these assumptions that unemployment and maybe education or other reasons being given should be tested. If it is true for us in Africa, we should ask ourselves why our youth are actually lured into this violent extremism because of these reasons, and why is it different from Europe? Because in Europe probably is not the case, which I've given here. So the reasons could be tested. Now, the key definition of youth also goes into the African Union Charter, the Youth Charter, that defines youth in terms of age. So they say a youth is an individual who is from between 15 to 35 years old. Now, in other classification of youth, like the UN, they say from 16 to 24. But when I investigated why these figures are different, I found that some of them are actually suitable for statistical reasons. That goes into the planning, with economic planning of the World Bank, for example, and then the UN thinks globally it should be between 16 to 24. However, if you look at individual countries like Rwanda and Sierra Leone, they think the youth should be up to 35 years old. And they lower the 16 years to 15, because it looks like our African youth begin to be 15 when they are very, very mature in their mind. So basically, are we looking at psychological strengths and growth, or what is it that makes these differences in our research? So I have adopted the African Union Charter that defines the youth between 15 and 35 years old. There are also some problems again. A girl who is 15 years old and is already a mother and has a responsibility of a child, sometimes, not only sometimes, in most cases, in many societies, she is not a youth anymore. She is supposed to be an adult who is taking care of another youth child. So how are we going to say, well, responsibilities cut us off from the definition of being a youth? How can we say, yes, we take care of that? So this is the working definition for this research. Youth between 15 to 35 years old in the African context. The African Charter also within that outlines the rights and responsibilities, saying that youth are partners in the first place. They are assets that are required for sustainable development and for peace and prosperity in Africa. So if we look at rights of these individuals, for example, the example I've just given, the right of that mother, as a youth, is already removed and placed to be an adult. So she's expected to be an adult. And therefore, she relinquishes to have that right of being a youth at some point. In some places, that mother is not allowed to go back to school and study as a youth again. In some cases, she will be told, tell us where you're going to leave the child first before we can enroll you back in school. So certain rights will not be enjoyed by this kind of individuals. And could that be also one of some reasons that we say, yes, there's a problem in our society, and it would be very easy for someone to come and grab this young girl whose mind has not yet been developed and could be easily turned into joining radical groups. Another word which is associated in this research is actually extremism. We talk so much about people being to the extreme and people who are actually supposed to be going through these processes, and then in the end they become violent. So what is extremism? Two things that emerge from my preliminary findings in the literature. Extremism is both descriptive and prescriptive. It is usually pejorative, though it is sometimes used in a purely descriptive sense, referring simply to a viewpoint that is inconsistent with existing norms. And rather than implying that the extremist position constitutes a threat to the society, government, mainstream, morality, and so forth. Actually, in this case, an extreme person does not recognize himself as being extreme. However, it is now the society or another group of people who would think this is an extreme person. So it is both descriptive and also prescriptive in its own sense. So from a social spectrum perspective, it is about ideology. How this ideology can be considered far outside the mainstream of the society. And therefore that qualifies you to be an extreme person. And this could be in terms of attitudes, this could be in terms of some of the words that you mentioned, and some of the ideas that come out from that individual. And the society begins to say, yes, you have moved out of the norms that is required. Therefore, you have become an extreme person. So it is also understood as an ideology that goes against the social ethos of a society and violates common moral standards. But we cannot say that all the society behave the same way. So maybe what is accepted in Tanzania with the albinos, or in some areas with the albinos sacrifice, would not be accepted, not even be thought of at all in another society. So how do we begin to measure how society rates its own people within the society, within the norms that they respect? So once that society says, yes, you have moved out of this continuum of what the society expects from you, then you are extreme. Now, not all extremists are violent. This is a very important point. I want you to take it from me, that not all extremists are violent. some extremists express significant dissent without necessarily being violent. And conversely, all terrorists are by definition violent extremists because they have gone to a different level of being extreme and they become violent. Once they become violent, that is different. But again, and contrary to some analysts' misconception, not all violent extremists are terrorists. I hope I make sense here. Not all extremists are violent. Not all the extreme people are violent. Some people who are extreme, or say, okay, I give an example of people who are very passionate about their diet and they are vegetarians. Some of them go to the level of vegans. Vegans are supposed to be a little bit more violent because they go and release all the animals out, they power milk out, they go and destroy the farms that actually does testing for medicine on monkeys. So they become a little bit more extreme and violent. Those ones could be termed very different. But there are other vegetarians who simply stick to their diet and they eat whatever they eat without disturbing anyone about their diets. But they're extreme. So you wouldn't go and tell them, you eat beef, eat pork chops, eat chicken, drink milk and yogurt. They would say no, and that is it. For a vegan, it would go beyond no and would result in some kind of action. There are so many examples of people who are extreme. There are others who are politicians who are so extreme in their views. But they are not violent. They could not be violent. So in our research, we're going to look at also mechanisms by which we can understand youth non-violently, but could be extreme. Now, then I heard the word violent to extremism. This is where we are in our research. Violent extremism is the beliefs and actions. So it goes from beliefs and heads on action. And it becomes a visible act of an individual or people who support or use violence to achieve ideological goals. I've actually restricted myself into these three sectors. But we could even have environmental violent extremists. We could also have social violent extremist groups, but it would be difficult to measure. So this includes terrorism and other forms of politically motivated and communal violence. So we can actually, within communal violence, we can locate violent extremism, not necessarily those who are subscribed to particular religious groups. And here, if a person or a group decides that fear, terror, and violence are justified to achieve ideological, political, and social change, and then acts accordingly, this is violent extremism. So now here we don't stop at only the belief. So the action needs to be substantiated by putting in fear, by putting in terror, and also physically showing some actions that kills. You see bombs, somebody exploding in the street. So all these aspects put together because of an ideological divergences, because of the political disagreements, because of the social change and the resistance to that, it becomes violent extremism. But it must be a belief, it must be expressed, it must be in action. And those actions are substantiated by causing fear, by causing violence, and also resisting to change. But what drives people to be violent in the extreme sense? I have two factors. One is the push factor that we will be looking at. What pushes youth to join violent extremism? So the conditions conducive to violent extremism and the structural context from which it emerges is very, very important. So here we're looking at context, the the structures around youth and how they are exposed to certain situations whereby they are pushed to join. This includes lack of socio-economic opportunities. These are reasons given in literatures. Marginalization and discrimination, poor governance, violations of human rights and the rule of law, prolonged and unresolved conflicts, and radicalization, for example, in prisons, in cells, and so forth. So when they go maybe for petty offense in prison for 5 years, they will meet people who can radicalize them in prison. And then when they come out, they're worse than ever in the correction. So then the second factor is the pull factor, which means definitely that individual motivation and processes play a role in transforming ideas and grievances into violent extremist action. These include individual backgrounds of motivations. If the individual is actually living with people who have these extreme ideas every day, every time, from football, from morning to evening, and the individual is actually living with these people, he is forced, is pulled to join these kind of groups. And there's collective grievance and victimization. For example, we are always victimized. We are Muslims, we are terrorists, we are Al-Qaeda, and victimization. Even somebody who has no idea will definitely get pulled into this and become radicalized. And then also, of course, there's too much domination, oppression, subjugation, or foreign intervention, distortion, and misuse of beliefs, political ideologies, and ethnic and cultural differences, and leadership and social networks. All these factors contribute to pulling youth to become violent, extremists, and to the extent that they can be violent. So what motivates people? There must be also some kind of motivation. Even there are some youth who live with their peers and friends who are extremists, that still they don't get violent. So what is the key motivation here? One, motivations are varied, and many usually relate to particular ideologies. Research has found that ideologies has actually been one of the most prominent motivation for individuals joining extremist group. Then the interpretation of either political debates or religious texts is also one of that. And issues such as environment or economic concern has also joined into the debate about what motivates people to join violent extremist groups. And others are ethnic or separatist causes. So people who want to separate from or having a secession from another country can develop an extreme idea of their own identity, and they want to live with that identity and separate from the state, from another country. And also, if we have an ethnic community who are threatened, they are marginalized, they are few, they can develop some form of resistance to contain and believe and have their own coping mechanism by which they want to identify themselves with, because of the fear that they will be marginalized and annihilated. If there is a war and there is an ethnic group which is going to face ethnic cleansing, such a group can become very extreme, however few they are. So people can also be motivated by more than one issue. It could be a combination of many things. One example I found in the literature is how one lady who got through serious relationship abuse and divorce 3 times became very violent and got motivated in joining extremists and killing men, using men and killing them, using men. So she became a serial killer of adult men whom she would actually approach and lure them. And because she has the motivation that of hatred already in her mind, she became an extreme and she started killing men. So extremism are motivated under the ideological violence. What is it? Political ideologies such as nationalists, Boko Haram, for example, that want to rule the country using Sharia law. So their political motivation is based on Sharia law for the whole nation to be ruled by Sharia law. The LRA have a motivation to rule Uganda using the 10 Commandments of God, nothing else. The Constitution has to change and say, this is the 10 Commandments of God, 1, 2, 3, 4, we must follow all that. And that is the rule that we will use for ruling the country, for governing the country. And everybody must live within that confines. Anybody who lives outside that must be eliminated. Not even put in prison, but eliminated. And elimination is always maybe killing and so forth. So there's always a hate group around this political group who advocate time and again the use of violence. So ideological violence is on top of my findings so far. And then there are some extreme interpretations of religious ideologies and beliefs that advocate the use of violence promoted by groups such as Al-Qaeda and the Army of God, and I've just given that example. Then there are some motivations which are based on issues within the society. I mentioned about animal liberation or environmental activists. The issue for them is animals are not supposed to be confined, eaten, or for some reasons traded. They're supposed to be free. Release the monkeys, let them be free. Don't eat the cows. God has given them life. Don't step on insects, crawling insects. They have their own rights. Let them live. So if you begin to kill a snake, they will say, oh my God, what are you doing? Don't you think it has life? Who are you to take away that life? It's only God who can take that life. So why are you eating something that has life in it? And somehow, sometimes people will also argue that even the plants and the leaves and the branches of trees that you are eating came from a life. So you end up into a discussion. But issue-based are very dangerous sometimes. Sometimes it will look like, okay, it's simple, but it can be very dangerous. There are also people who are anti-government because of certain key issues in the society. And for example, those who are against globalization, they would go and chain themselves and stop the train from moving or constructing a new railway line. They block the train and they become like extremist group. And those who are against the capitalist movement, for example, and those who are against also the socialist movement, those who are advocating the use of violence as a means to resolve issues. So issue-based are there in our society today. Among the pastoralists, the issue is always resources. Grass, grazing land, access to water. If you begin to limit that, it becomes an issue, and you'll find a Turkana will be an extreme, or a Gia will be an extreme, to the extent that he knows that is the only source of livelihood, and they will do everything, take it or leave it, in order to get access to water for their cows. Otherwise, they will perish. Now, ethno-nationalist separatist violence. This is mainly, I've taken this mainly from the Republican Army, IRA. If you look at the Tamil Tigers, these were actually mostly ethno-nationalists. The ETA in Spain, these are also some groups. I don't know the connection here in the context of Africa, because many people are saying ethnic-based conflict today is more or less of an ethno-nationalist kind of revenge, of violence, where a particular group of people who are armed, for example, we will be having, for example, the Dinka who are in power in South Sudan, will be fighting with the Nuer who also want to have power, absolute power. And then there are other ethnic groups that will join in, saying that the domination of one tribe has caused violence in this country. So we also unite as a tribe to fight and remove the domineering group. If it consistently goes along that line and it becomes an issue can either result into some kind of request that the Equatorians will want to separate from the mainland of South Sudan and rule themselves, or unite and fight one domineering group. So that becomes a little bit tricky. But here is a situation that ethno-nationalist separatist groups will always be there as one of that. So in general, countering violent extremism has reached to many levels. I start from the UN level, where the UN General Assembly resolution was passed on the General Secretary's plan of action. If you get to this level, you will find that there was a plan of action to prevent violent extremism, which was already issued out by the UN General Secretary in 2016. And the member states also stressed that it is essential to address the threat posed by violent extremism as and when conducive to terrorism, and recognize that violent extremism cannot and should not be associated with any religion, nationality, civilization, or ethnic group. Now here is a situation where we see the UN trying to separate these issues away from what I've just mentioned, the motivations. So where is the contradiction? This is a purely policy issue against reality on the ground. People joined these groups based on what I've given, and it's exactly what the UN says it should be separated away. The question is how? And the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy of 2006 also calls for a very holistic and inclusive approach to counterterrorism. This is also where we are coming from, a very holistic. We want an inclusive mechanism that puts youth into the center of countering violent extremism. So here we also trade along the UN strategy. So violent extremism has some strands and attempts that has been made. There is a global framework for preventing violent extremism. This is contained in the UN Charter. And in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's there. And looks at the global counterterrorism strategy, which puts Security Council Resolution 2078 in 2014 in the center of this decision. It's as recent as 2014. Another attempt that is there is the National Prevention of Violent Extremism Plans of Action. This is the one that I've just mentioned. It's also an initiative what the UN has done. Then there is a recommendation which is there, but I've not seen much being taken on board from the Regional Prevention of Violent Extremism Plans of Action. Regional. Now, when we are talking globally, regional could be Africa and the 5 continents. But when we're talking within the African region, then we talk of IGAD, ECOWAS, SADC, and other regions. But here, in this sense, it is both regional and sub-regional. We still don't have a clear plan of action in how we can counter violent extremism, even if there are so many initiatives which is going on at the moment. Then we have mobilizing resource initiative. This is mainly coming from the US Homeland Security, who are trying to say, yes, we need to mobilize resources in order to furnish people, the communities, the society, civil society, so that they're able to have these resources within themselves and come up with their mechanisms by which, how they can address violent extremism. This move is mainly information sharing and intelligence gathering because of what we call the homegrown terrorists, which is becoming more and more in many countries. So how do you mobilize resources to understand who is actually a terrorist in your neighborhood? Could be even your brother, could be even your uncle. But how comes these homegrown terrorists are actually thriving until when it emerges out? So that was one of the, that is one of the plan of action. There's 7 priority areas that action is being taken on or recommended should take on. Priority number 1 is, can we have dialogue and prevent violent extremism to continue in our society? So one thing is, let's talk, let's discuss, So let's have a framework that is broader enough, that can prevent conflict from happening. And this is coming from the Secretary General recommendation. Now, here is how do we engage opposing parties and regional actors? How do we forge international consensus and engage religious leaders? Under this, the criticism here is that, can we negotiate with terrorists? Can we negotiate with terrorists? And how? The question broadens even to the extent that when do we have to talk to the terrorists? Not only how, but when. Other schools of thought are saying, how do we begin to talk with terrorists? Should we talk around them, or look at the ideology they have and influence them, or get policies that can bring everybody on board and eliminate the group until when they call upon us that they're willing to talk? And some schools of thought say, no, it's not about dialogue. Beat them, beat them, beat them, beat them, until when they're weak, then they will seek for dialogue and then talk. But there is one priority area that action is being framed should take place: dialogue and conflict prevention. Another area is, let us strengthen good governance in all the countries so that we have transparency, we have human rights and the rule of law, and the government institutions are stronger to deal with some of these issues that we have in the society today. So how do we do that? Let us strengthen good governance. Another one is engage the communities, which is already happening. I mentioned a few of that. And then get recommendations from the community, get the contextual understanding and the structural understanding of how that society builds their norms, and even qualifies one of their members to be an extreme person because that's gone out of the context, the social context. Then we have empowering the youth. This is where we are. The priority areas is all over the world now. There are 7 of them. One, of course, is empowering the youth. Here is about harnessing the ideology that youth have to pick along the line when they're growing, when they're working together with their friends. What ideology do we have the youth to carry? This morning I was listening to one of the debaters on Kenyan TV. He was saying that youth in Kenya have said clearly that given the chance, they will be corrupt if they get a job. There's no question about it, because they want to live like any other person who flies a helicopter, who has a V8. So there's nothing wrong if they will be corrupt. And he's saying that we have not cultivated ideological, moral sense in our youth, to the extent that youth that do not have that sense of feeling that, yes, we don't have to be corrupt. They cannot differentiate because that's the way they have been taught. Sometimes they have been punished, that stealing is bad. So instead, they find ways of getting around it so that they can actually be corrupt. So another area is gender equality and empowering women, which is now a very important area as well. In our research, we have gender dimension. Another area is education, skills development, and empowerment facilities. This is where so many NGOs are working, and international development agencies are working in these areas: empowerment, capacity building, education, skills development, and so forth. Another area is strategic communications, which is the internet and social media. This goes back to youth. Majority of the population of youth are actually falling within this area. They communicate a lot among themselves. So that is generally where our research will be leading. Somebody will be asking, why haven't you talked about terrorism as a concept? The other things I've mentioned, fundamentalism, extremism, radicalization, all are elements of terrorism. And the counterterrorism measures and the framework is actually based on all these figures. So I've not I've purposely left the issue of terrorism as a definition because of those elements that were fit into the definition. So our problem in our research is simple. We want to address key drivers that we mentioned and that enhances violent extremism, and we want to see how they have been tried, and even those suggested ones, and how will they actually achieve, even if it is limited. How will it be achieved? How does it achieve countering violent extremism in itself? What results do we have? So there have been trends of increased counter-violence based on the hard approach, which is mainly military. But have we tried any other means with the youth? If not, then maybe we need to think about it. If we tried and it did not succeed, we need to investigate why. And then, of course, the marginalization of communities, which really targets many youth and women as vulnerable groups of the society. They are mostly attracted to this kind of joining violent extremism using ideologies. And however, there seems to be a general lack of awareness of best practices in CVE among the growing number of stakeholders, governments, and non-governmental organizations, and so forth. So we want to investigate these contextual issues: poverty, unemployment, lack of opportunities. Are they the factors really? So we have an objective we want to inform policy and practices in CVE interventions within the IGAD region in order to engage and empower youth. So this project is also about youth empowerment, both male and female. And specifically, we want to identify and analyze the factors that predispose youth, male and female, to engage in violent extremism in Uganda and Kenya. Here I've been talking about IGAD, but now I'm talking about Uganda and Kenya. I will explain why. We want to identify those strategies and ways by which we can create to deepen interventions that can engage and empower youth in Kenya and Uganda. We want to analyze those existing policies and practices which are related to countering violent extremism, with the view that it will actually lead us into putting a framework that can include youth from bottom and also from the top. So there's an issue of participation, but we suspect there's an issue of policy here. So the question is that how can this research inform policy and even generate debates and practices on the ground that we know, bring them together so that we can coin what we call CVE interventions and engage and empower the youth in the IGAD region. So this is the broader research question, and it's about what are the driving factors, of course, and what are the mechanisms, infrastructure, and resources that we need, and how can policies and practice related to CVE enhance the creation of space for youth. Now, the methods we are using for the research, I'm sorry, I'm just talking too much of detailed ideas about this research, and I want you to get it because this is a very important point for us to start with. So the question of how are we going to generate all this information, put it out there, and then come up with an inclusive mechanism. How do we do that? One, we think that it is better to have a longitudinal study, a design that combines both quantitative data that we have, or we will generate, with the narratives. So there's no way we can say there are already quantitative figures in papers all out there that we need to look for, and again put this against the narrative, and then look at the convergences and the divergences, whether this data that we have actually can inform us to come up with something. So it's going to be a longitudinal survey design with quantitative and qualitative design for 3 years. Here, two things. The process, we will have a process to benchmark with international best practices like those frameworks I've mentioned. And then the second measure is to provide consistent device for making a distinction and gauge differences in the data. Then the third measurement is correlation analysis. We will do correlation analysis, and this is a provision of precise estimate of the degree of relationship between CVE concepts and inequality in youth. Are we just talking about inequality in youth, or we are talking about active involvement in violent extremism? And how do we counter what is inequality, and how do we counter what has been generated as a result of ideology? The approach is bottom-up. We want really to generate data from the bottom. Communities, the youth, who are really in the rural areas. And I mentioned we are happy to work with PeaceNet because of their grassroots establishments. And the tools we are going to use are questionnaires, in interview guide, and focus group discussions, and others will be generated as when we will be progressing with the research in the field. The unit of analysis is Kenya. In Kenya, we will have Mombasa County. We will go to Lamu County. We will go to Garissa County. Initially, we thought of Madera, but because of the extreme cases of violence, we might not be able to go to Madera. So we have thought we should go to Garissa, and then Kisumu. Now, why we have chosen these areas is very interesting. Many people will ask, why these areas? These areas form the basic of our units of analysis. There are areas that we think they are hotspots. There are areas that already have some aspects of youth education going on as a result of joining extremism, and they want to get out. There are areas that are already actually like a boiling volcano, yet to erupt, and things are actually coming out. So we did a preliminary study and found that, yes, we need to sample areas that, one, is closer to Somali, because Somali is an extreme case that we were asked not to be getting into because of the little resource we have. We cannot take even Somali alone. So it's better to choose at least two countries, one with medium to serious case, which is Kenya, and then another country which is on the verge of building up this radicalization, which is Uganda. So with its unique features, Uganda has a post-CVE issue, which is the LRA that Lena was talking about. And this radicalization from LRA has ended, but people are in post-conflict. But there is a very high chance that the same group who have been radicalized, but they're still under 35, they can be the dangers in the very near future. So we have Kisumu, which is close to Uganda. And in that belt, there are so many things happening. And it connects us to Uganda along Busia and Malaba area. Then Lamu, of course, we know what has been happening there, in Mombasa. We will link up with another cohort team who are also doing a similar research, but they are based in the University of Dar es Salaam. And for them, they will be visiting areas like Solo, and you're saying Gisu? Yeah. How do you call it? Was in Gisu. So we have decided to leave those areas for them, but we have collaboration, and they also got the same funding to do exactly more or less a similar case in Tanzania. So we will link up with them. In Uganda, we have Arua, which is West Nile, part of bordering Congo, DRC, and South Sudan. It's a very volatile area right now as a result of many factors. Post-LRA, the current situation in South Sudan, with so many refugees, people having guns and they are radicalized, and DRC, which has actually a house that puts these people together and hide them. And you can train in the bush and come back and do anything you want. Gulu and Kitgum is the LRA area, and we're talking of post-LRA, post-radicalization area. And then we have Kasese, a very hot bed now, Lina mentioned, where one of the king has been arrested, and a number of issues are going on there. And Kasese borders DRC and also takes some of the issues from Rwanda. So we are also talking about border issues here, which is very important. Probably we should be looking at how this radicalization takes place from one country to the other. How do we understand radicalization in Kenya, which affects Uganda? I'm talking of online, not by flight. So, because this radicalization is very slow, systematic, and planned. It is an ideological implant into the minds of these youth. Then we have Mbale. Mbale is actually, Mbale and Kisumu are connected in the eastern part of Uganda, then western part of Kenya, they are connected. So Gulu Kitgum is also connected to South Sudan and has a number of refugees. And Gulu Kitgum connects also to the other side of Karamoja, where guns are actually ferried from. There's no control. So these are the units of analysis. We have picked 4 because of the limited funding that we have. We cannot go to all the areas. But with the help of PeaceNet, I am sure that your on-the-ground connections will give us a clear indication. Who should we talk to when we go to Mombasa? Who are the people we are looking at in Mombasa and Lamu? And if we go to Kitgum and Gulu, Lena will tell us, who exactly are we going to talk to? What kind of tools are we going to use in Gulu and Kitgum? Are we going to have focus group discussion? Are they ethically aware and informed that they can talk to us freely? Amidst all that, one of the key partners that we have outside the arrangement is the Ugandan government and the Kenyan government. I think Sam has mentioned. There's no way we can conduct this research successfully without involving the government. Right from the start, we said, yes, we must involve the government, and the government have full knowledge about what we're doing. So they are also part of this research because they are part of the policymakers. So, and that is where we want to influence. So the procedures of the research, in the first year, we will have, we have already developed some of the instruments, which Professor has talked about. And then today, we are having the Inception research, workshop. From that, we will have research team training, which will be, the team that are part of this research, PeaceNet, Uganda, Kenya, and also IGAD, together with OSSREA. They need to be trained to see how some of these things are working. And then we will have another training on methodology and how institutions, the institutional partners will work together. And we will come up with a baseline field study. And then we have a communication tool that will be developed. And then there will be research uptake communication and knowledge management, which will be presented to you tomorrow by one of my colleagues. And then the second year, we shall have training manual that has been developed for youth, policymakers, and all stakeholders that we feel should have access to how we can counter violent extremism. This training manual is very important. It will be edited, it will be reviewed, and we will print them and supply them to all the offices. And then the training of trainers for policymakers, we will bring policymakers together with civil society and academia, and train them in Uganda and in Kenya. The same will happen actually with the youth. And then there will be a national dissemination policy workshop that will come in, and there will be another research uptake which cuts across year 1, year 2, year 3. And then we have a midterm review, evaluation, which will come in the middle of the second year. And then the third year we'll have a learning alliance workshop that is bringing something closer now to what we call inclusive mechanisms. And here we will have CSO, focus group, FBOs, training centers, security actors, and so forth. We'll train them and give them this workshop in the Learning Alliance. Then we have the Learning Alliance for Youth as well. And we will have regional policy dialogue conference that will bring many people all together. We'll have another research update, and then the end-line research report, which is the final report in the third year. And the specific output, of course, we look at some of the roles. This one, I think you can find them in my paper. We want to see the structured roles and responsibilities, of course, with the partners. We want to review research objectives, and I want you to help us to check if these research objectives are really what we are supposed to be working with. And is this the right methodology that we have chosen? You're going to work on this later. And I need your help on that. And I want you to help us with the timelines. Timelines are very important because Kenya is going for election, 2018, right? 2017 in August. So if our work is supposed to be here in Kenya somehow within those days, how do we harmonize times? We're talking of rainy season. We are talking of very hot areas where war can break in any time. So I want to eagerly say yes, before you even conduct any regional conference on policy, IGAD is having a very big conference on the same. So will theirs be before us or after us? So do we need to change our days? Because these are the people who will say, yes, you can carry on because this is exactly what we want. So, and then again, refining the monitoring and evaluation tool. We think that the M&E is very important right from today until the end to monitor what is going on. And then we have, of course, the knowledge management and research uptake, which my brother Lemo will talk about. I'll finish very shortly. Give me like 5 minutes. This is the chart. Objective 1, we have 3 objectives, if you remember. And this is what we want you to do today. An Inception report, we have the meeting, we have presentations, photographs, refine, and this is what Trofina has mentioned. We want to come up with this quality CVE research process. Very high quality, good, precise, and we want to accomplish capacity of research team to be strengthened. And this will filter down to actually even data collectors that some will actually generate from Kenya for us, and also what Lina will generate for us. They must be people who have quality. So we are starting in March 2017, and we want also to develop the methodology, training curriculum, and these are some of the things that we will be doing later. When we go back at OSSREA, I will be doing this desktop research to build on the paper that I've already given you, the background paper. We'll build on that and have desktop research, and we'll produce these 2 fact sheets that we think should be between May and June. And here is a situation where we have a baseline study and a field study. That is what I expected, that probably will be a problem in Kenya because it falls within the August month when election is taking place. And that is also when we want to collect data in Kenya and Uganda. So this is just like now informing you of other objectives that will follow in September 2017, and then in February up to June, then we have July midterm review. So we think that by July 2018, we have a midterm review. And about 5 or 6 milestones would have the second milestone would be delivered. This is the training manual is developed. So we will review that.